In 2001, an unimaginable ray of light burst forth from a case file that had gathered dust for half a century. The 5-year-old boy who vanished without a trace in North Carolina in 1951 was confirmed to be still alive. He had grown up, started a family, and had no idea that he had once been the center of a desperate search that lasted decades. In an instant, the truth hit like an earthquake. The name he had carried his entire life was not his real one. The family he had known was not his biological family, and his past had been torn from his parents' arms on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. Today, I will plunge you straight into the heart of a tragedy that spanned 50 years. What happened on that fateful day in 1951. Why a child could disappear without leaving a trace, and how fate quietly rewrote an entire life under a different identity. This is not just a missing person case. This is one of the rarest, most painful and most haunting cold cases in American history, where the truth arrived late, but with enough force to shake everything. You are my most precious gems. Take a deep breath, because right now, we are about to step together into a journey where time, memory, and justice collide to their utmost limits. Before diving deep into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys uncovering buried truths, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next cases. North Carolina in 1951 still carried the atmosphere of post-World War II America, a society trying to return to normal life after years of upheaval, where small towns operated more on mutual trust than fear, where homes were rarely locked during the day, and children were considered safe playing around the neighborhood without close adult supervision. Especially in semi-rural areas like the one where Stephen Allen lived, where his family was a familiar part of the local community, an ordinary working-class family with a simple life, the father working full-time, the mother managing the household and caring for the children. With daily routines revolving around church, school, and close neighborly relationships, Stephen Allen, 5 years old, was the youngest child in the family, the smallest and the one who received the most attention from everyone. A child with a small build, moderately active, accustomed to playing independently in the area around the home, often watched over by relatives during times when adults were busy, and on the day of the incident, the person directly responsible for watching Stephen was a close family member who was familiar with the boy's habits and believed that keeping an eye from a distance was sufficient, since the surrounding environment was familiar and no serious incidents had ever occurred before. That afternoon unfolded according to the usual daily routine, with no family conflicts, no warning signs of a tragedy. Stephen still within the general view of the adults, playing near the home area, and it was precisely that familiarity that lowered the level of vigilance when an unusual element appeared, a detail that was unclear, but different from every other day. Perhaps the appearance of a stranger, a behavior that didn't fit the surrounding context, or a situation that made a witness momentarily feel not entirely at ease, but still chose to trust in the community's inherent safety, convincing themselves that there was no reason to worry excessively, the hesitation lasting only a short time, but enough for the opportunity to intervene to slip away. And when attention returned, Stephen was no longer in his familiar spot, the disappearance not occurring in a dramatic moment, but as a silent void that appeared, causing those around to initially assume the boy had simply moved to another area. But as the search in the nearby vicinity continued, the unease grew when no clear signs showed where Stephen was. The family began calling his name, checking every familiar corner, asking the nearest neighbors, and it was at this point that the small mistakes accumulated earlier revealed their consequences, because no one could pinpoint the exact moment Stephen was last seen, nor was anyone certain about the boy's final direction of movement. Information from witnesses became vague when faced with pressure and panic, memories no longer sharp, details once overlooked now unable to be accurately recreated. And when the spontaneous search yielded no results, real fear began to spread through the family, no longer assuming a child momentarily lost, but recognizing that something serious had happened. The decision to report to the police was made in a state of emergency and desperation, marking the moment Stephen Allen was no longer just a child in the family, but became an official missing person case, closing what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, and opening a tragedy that at that time, no one in the family could imagine the extent and consequences of. The missing person report call was received while Stephen Allen's family was still in a state of panic that had not yet settled, the initial information conveyed incompletely, mixed with haste and gaps that could not yet be filled, but enough for the local police department to determine this was no longer a normal daily situation, but a case requiring official intervention, especially since the missing person was a 5-year-old child, and the timeline was unclear. Immediately after receiving the report, the police proceeded to record the case according to the standard procedures of that era, establishing an initial missing person file based on the most basic facts that could be gathered in a short time, including the victim's identity, age, residence address, family situation, those present on the day of the incident, and the area believed to be where Stephen Allen was last seen. However, right from this initial step, clear difficulties emerged when there was no precise timestamp for the moment of disappearance, since Stephen's vanishing was not directly witnessed by anyone, but only discovered after an undetermined gap, making the classification of the case complicated, unable to immediately confirm whether this was an abduction or an accident, only temporarily categorizing it as a missing child with unknown cause. In the process of building the file, the police had to rely largely on accounts from the family and primary witnesses, who were under heavy psychological pressure and could not provide information coherently, leading to many important details being recorded as estimates rather than certain facts, especially the central question of the last timestamp when Stephen was still under adult control, as differing accounts pointed to varying time intervals, some believing it was only a few minutes before discovery, others thinking Stephen had been absent for longer without notice. This lack of consistency forced investigators to establish a relatively broad estimated time frame, wide enough to cover possibilities, but also meaning diluting the initial search focus. Parallel to determining the time, the police collected basic descriptions of Stephen Allen, including appearance, clothing believed to be worn that day, movement habits, usual play range, and familiar locations he might go to on his own, all to serve delimiting the search area and assessing the likelihood of Stephen wandering off versus external intervention. But at this point, due to the social context and limited investigative experience with child abductions, the accident or wandering hypothesis was still considered more reasonable in the initial assessment. Quick interviews with the family were conducted almost immediately, focusing on reconstructing the day's events, identifying who was responsible for watching Stephen, those who had contact with the boy, and any factors considered unusual compared to daily routine. However, these exchanges did not occur in ideal conditions, as panic emotions and underlying guilt made responses defensive or inconsistent. Investigators had to continually clarify information points, but could not avoid recording unverified accounts. Meanwhile, surrounding witnesses were also approached quickly, mainly to determine if anyone saw Stephen leave the familiar area, or noticed a stranger's appearance in the relevant time frame, but results at this stage were mostly vague, descriptions not matching, and not specific enough to form a clear investigative direction. From those fragmented data, the investigating agency had to establish preliminary hypotheses to guide further actions, in which the hypothesis of Stephen wandering far and encountering an accident was prioritized as fitting the common perception of that era. The hypothesis of being taken by someone else was noted, but not yet central due to lack of direct evidence, while the possibility of criminal elements was ranked low, only noted as a contingency. This prioritization directly affected resource allocation and time in the first hours, as investigators had to make quick decisions amid incomplete information and increasing pressure from the family and community. While the file continued to be completed with each small detail added, The police simultaneously had to balance preserving the scene for investigation and the urgent search needs of the family and neighbors, a balance difficult to achieve in practice, especially without clear signs. This was a criminal case, and this hesitation made the initial investigation more reactive than proactive, with steps taken to keep up with the situation rather than lead it. All these factors created a picture of an investigation just activated in a rushed state, lacking certain facts and heavily influenced by the social context as well as methodological limitations, laying the foundation for the entire subsequent process that at that time, no one could foresee the complexity and duration of the case. After the missing person file was established and preliminary hypotheses formed, the focus of handling the case quickly shifted to the area identified as where Stephen Allen was last seen, where police approached under conditions no longer intact as a proper crime scene, because before authorities arrived, this space had been traversed multiple times by the family, neighbors, and those participating in spontaneous searches in hopes of finding the child as soon as possible, making the boundary between potential scene and ordinary living space blurred. Approaching the scene thus was more evaluative than preservative. Investigators had to rely on what remained to reconstruct the context rather than observe an untouched state directly. The area around the home and familiar paths were swept in the initial range, but no clear signs of a struggle were recorded, no unusually disturbed objects, nor any bloodstains or direct physical signs indicating Stephen had been forced to leave. This making the possibility of a violent abduction immediately assessed low in the initial judgment. When evaluating the overall scene condition, police noted it was an open environment, where many people could enter and exit without leaving easily noticeable traces, especially in weather and ground conditions unfavorable for preserving footprints or movement signs, combined with the area already familiar for children's play, making distinguishing between incident-related traces and daily activity traces nearly impossible, leading to the decision to focus on indirect signs rather than expecting direct evidence. The initial evidence collection process was thus limited, mainly based on noting what was deemed potentially related, including identifying entry-exit paths, blind spots, routes Stephen might take if leaving the familiar area on his own, and positions from which a stranger could approach without drawing attention. But these notes were mostly inferential rather than based on specific physical evidence, as no personal items of Stephen were found at the scene at this time, nor signs he had left behind toys or carried objects during the disappearance. Limitations in evidence preservation became clear when investigators realized that any potential traces, if they had existed, had been obliterated by the community's initial search efforts, which stemmed from good intentions but inadvertently lost the opportunity to collect accurate information in the critical phase, while scene lockdown procedures were not applied thoroughly, due to lack of basis to confirm this as a criminal case, leading to the scene not being controlled to strict standards. Parallel to physical evaluation, police cross-referenced collected scene data with initial family and witness statements, trying to find compatibility or contradictions between the actual space and descriptions, but results did not yield a clear picture, as descriptions of Stephen's last appearance position were not precise enough to pinpoint a specific spot, and the absence of prominent physical traces further reinforced the sense that if Stephen left this area, it had happened quietly, without notice, and without clear signs. From those evaluations, the initial assessment of the case's nature gradually formed, in which the possibility of Stephen wandering far or encountering an accident during movement was seen as more fitting the scene status than the criminal intervention hypothesis, as the absence of coercion signs was often viewed as an important indicator in abductions, especially in the context of limited investigative experience of that era, and the concept of stranger child abductions not yet fully recognized as in later decades. This leading to subsequent investigative decisions built on a foundation tending to downplay criminal possibility, not because completely ruled out, but due to insufficient material basis to prioritize it. The entire scene approach and evaluation process in this phase thus clearly reflected the limits of the initial investigation, where investigators had to draw conclusions based on the absence of evidence rather than its presence, a situation not uncommon in child missing cases but carrying long-term consequences, as assessments formed from the initial scene would directly influence the case's direction in the following days. And in Stephen Allen's case, the scene said nothing specific, but that very silence contributed to shaping how the case was perceived from the very first steps. When the crime scene does not provide physical evidence strong enough to guide the investigation on its own, the focus inevitably shifts to people, specifically those who were present during the time Stephen Allen disappeared, or who might have observed part of the events before and after that moment, with the primary witness, the person responsible for watching Stephen on the day of the incident, becoming the first subject to be interviewed, and also the one holding the most information, though not always clear information, because the initial interviews take place when memories are still fresh, but the witness's psychology is under heavy pressure from fear and a sense of responsibility, making the answers both reflexive and tending towards self-protection, requiring investigators to reconstruct each small time marker through consecutive questions to accurately determine where Stephen was, what he was doing, and during which periods he was no longer in direct line of sight. However, right from the first interview, gaps appeared when the witness could not confirm a specific time for the last moment Stephen was seen, only able to provide an estimate based on daily routines, which made the statement directional but lacking the necessary precision. Alongside clarifying the primary witness's account, police expanded the collection of statements from secondary witnesses, including family members, nearby neighbors, and those who might have seen Stephen that day, or noticed anything unusual in the area. These exchanges were conducted quickly with the goal of finding any detail that could help narrow the time frame or determine Stephen's final direction of movement, but the results showed clear fragmentation, each person only holding a small piece of information, no one having a complete picture, and descriptions of times, locations or the appearance of strangers did not fully match, even having statements that contradicted each other on the same detail, reflecting the instability of memory when the event was not perceived as serious at the moment it occurred. The process of comparing and cross-referencing statements thus became a complex task. Investigators had to place each account in the specific context of the person providing it, considering observation position, level of attention, relationship with Stephen's family, and psychological state at the time of the incident, thereby trying to eliminate details that were speculative or influenced by rumors. Retaining the rare overlapping points among statements such as relative time frames, common areas mentioned multiple times, or the unclear presence of a strange element that no one could fully describe. However, the very lack of an independent witness who could directly confirm the moment Stephen left the familiar area made this cross-referencing effort unable to create a decisive event marker. In that context, evaluating witness reliability became the key factor in shaping the investigative direction. The primary witness was considered reliable in terms of good faith, but limited in accuracy due to direct responsibility and psychological pressure, while secondary witnesses were seen as more objective, but lacking continuity in observation, leading to none of them being able to provide a statement strong enough to replace the role of physical evidence. This forced investigators to accept that most human data in the case was supportive, rather than decisive. From those evaluations, the initial investigative direction was adjusted toward a more pragmatic approach, focusing on reconstructing possibilities based on the highest probability scenarios, rather than pursuing a criminal hypothesis without clear basis, in which Stephen moving away from the familiar area on his own was seen as consistent with statements showing no signs of coercion or resistance, while also fitting the scene that left no unusual traces, whereas the possibility of outside intervention was noted as an option to monitor, but not yet elevated to the main focus of the investigation. This decision did not stem from completely ruling out criminal elements, but from the lack of specific data to justify allocating resources in that direction in the early stage. The entire process of handling witnesses and adjusting investigative direction in this phase clearly reflected how a child disappearance case was viewed in the social and professional context of that era, where human statements played a large role, but were easily influenced by unstable memories, psychological pressure, and preconceived assumptions, and it was from these foundations that the case's direction was formed, not by clear evidence, but by weighing what could be proven against what lacked sufficient basis to pursue to the end. When the statements had been collected and cross-referenced but still failed to form a solid enough marker to guide the investigation in a specific direction, expanding the search area was determined to be the necessary next step to take advantage of the period, still considered to have a chance, because in the perception of both the family and the authorities at that time, the possibility that Stephen Allen was still somewhere in the nearby area could not be ruled out, especially when there was no direct evidence showing the boy had left the locality by vehicle or that there was clear outside intervention. The search area was therefore expanded in a more systematic way compared to the initial spontaneous efforts, starting from the area around the house and familiar paths, then gradually spreading to vacant lots, trails, forested edges, less frequented spaces, auxiliary structures, and locations assessed as accessible to a 5-year-old child, if moving on his own, without obstruction. Determining these areas was based on a combination of local residents' knowledge and police professional assessment, creating a search map that was practical but not entirely accurate due to the lack of baseline data. Alongside expanding the geographical space, the search force was also mobilized on a larger scale, with the local community playing a central role in this phase as neighbors, acquaintances, church members, and volunteer groups willingly participated in the hope of directly contributing to finding the child. This mobilization stemmed not only from personal relationships with Stephen's family, but also from the social norms of that era, where incidents involving children were often seen as a shared responsibility of the entire community. In addition, local support forces within capacity were called upon, including those experienced in terrain searching, rescue groups, and individuals familiar with the surrounding area, creating a diverse search network in composition, but not uniform in skills and methods. The search methods deployed were mainly based on manpower and area division. Groups were assigned to thoroughly scan specific areas, according to general guidelines, walking to check the ground, searching through bushes, inspecting abandoned structures, warehouses, barns and hidden spots, while also inquiring with residents in farther areas to determine if anyone had seen a child matching Stephen's description in the relevant time period. However, the lack of modern support technology, such as tracking devices, centralized databases, or aerial observation meant the entire process relied heavily on human observation and memory, while objective factors like complex terrain, changing weather, and passing time gradually reduced the chance of detecting traces if they had ever existed. The results of these widespread search efforts did not yield decisive clues, no signs that Stephen was found in the scanned areas, nor did new physical evidence emerge enough to reorient the investigation. Each completed area ended in silence, and the repetition of these negative results began to create a clear shift in the perception of participants, from expecting that expanding the search would quickly bring answers to concern that the possibility Stephen was still in the areas being scanned might have been overestimated. In that context, pressure on the investigation team increased day by day. The family wanted to continue expanding the search area and maintaining high intensity, with slim hope that some area had not been checked thoroughly enough. The community raised increasingly direct questions about the effectiveness of the ongoing efforts, while the investigators themselves had to face the problem of resource allocation under conditions without new clues, because maintaining a widespread search campaign required manpower and time beyond the local area's ability to sustain indefinitely. This pressure was not only professional but also social, as each day without results increased. The sense of failure and responsibility, forcing the investigation team to continually reassess their decisions, while still maintaining sufficient presence to avoid giving the impression of giving up in the eyes of the public and the victim's family, a balance difficult to achieve when actual data did not support continuing to expand the search in the same manner. In that process, the limitations of the widespread search method gradually became clear, as mobilizing large numbers of people and checking many areas could create a sense of action and unity, but could not compensate for the lack of a focused investigative direction, especially when there were no signs indicating Stephen had moved along a specific route or left any physical evidence as a reference point. This left the investigation team facing an increasingly unavoidable reality that even though the search effort was expanded in scale, the chance of obtaining new results was diminishing over time. It was the contrast between the external intensity of action and the internal deadlock in data that changed the rhythm of the case in this phase, as the widespread search continued to be maintained for a certain period to meet expectations and rule out oversights, but at the same time raised increasingly urgent questions about whether the current method was still appropriate and whether continuing to allocate resources in the same direction was truly bringing the case closer to an answer, creating accumulating pressure on the investigation team as they had to weigh between prolonging the widespread search and the need to adjust strategy based on the reality that Stephen Allen had left absolutely no trace in the areas that had been scanned. When the widespread search activities yielded no specific results, and the possibility that Stephen Allen was still within the scanned areas became increasingly slim, the investigation team's attention was forced to shift to the smallest details that might have been overlooked in the early stage, and it was in that context that an item believed to be directly related to Stephen was discovered in an area not too far from where the boy was last seen. This information was quickly reported to the investigating agency and immediately became the new focus of the case, as it was the first time since Stephen disappeared that a material element appeared capable of being directly linked to the victim. Though its authenticity and significance could not yet be confirmed, the discovery of this item occurred during the re-scanning of areas previously checked but not thoroughly examined, indicating the possibility that the evidence had been there all along, but not recognized as important, or had appeared after the initial search waves ended, both possibilities raising different questions about the case's developments and the timing of Stephen leaving the familiar area. When the evidence was handed over to police, the process of verifying its connection to Stephen was conducted cautiously, including cross-checking with the family's description of the boy's personal belongings, determining how familiar the item was in his daily life, and assessing whether it truly belonged to Stephen, or was just a similar item belonging to another child in the area. Because in the shared living environment of a small community, identical children's items were not uncommon, this made the item's evidentiary value unable to be established, based solely on subjective perception. Alongside verifying origin, the investigation team analyzed the item's significance in relation to the hypotheses under consideration, asking whether its presence at the discovery location fit the scenario of Stephen moving on his own and dropping the item while walking, or whether it indicated the boy had been taken to or passed through this area by an external factor. However, the inability to precisely determine when the item appeared at that location made all conclusions speculative, as there was no basis to confirm that the evidence reflected the moment of disappearance, or was merely a secondary trace appearing later. In the context where the evidence was not strong enough to determine the nature of the case on its own, it still acted as a catalyst, causing the investigation team to begin seriously considering the possibility of intervention by a specific individual, especially as some prior statements had mentioned the appearance of a stranger in the area around the relevant time. Though those descriptions were vague and inconsistent, from there a list of potential suspects began to form based on basic criteria such as presence near the scene, behavior deemed unusual, history related to children, or factors making them stand out in the eyes of the local community. Identifying initial suspects was not based on decisive evidence, but was the result of elimination and inference. in which one individual drew more attention due to appearing in the area at a sensitive time and having characteristics that made them an easy target for suspicion. In the context of lacking data, the investigation team collected information on personal history, residence, social relationships, and activities on the day of the incident for this person, while cross-referencing with witness statements to determine the degree of match between described behavior and potential involvement in Stephen's disappearance. The suspect investigation was conducted within the legal and professional framework of that era, including informal interviews, checking statements about movement schedules, verifying alibis through available sources, and assessing cooperation attitude. However, these measures quickly revealed limitations when there was no direct physical evidence linking the suspect to the scene or to the newly discovered item, while the suspect's statements, though having some unconvincing points, were still not contradictory enough to become grounds for criminal processing. The lack of clear legal basis put the investigation team in a difficult position, as continuing to focus on a single suspect without solid evidence risked misdirecting the investigation and causing unwanted legal consequences, while removing this suspect from consideration also meant the case returned to a state lacking a specific target to follow. The evidence once hoped to be a turning point, thus gradually lost its central role as it could not provide further new information beyond confirming that Stephen had been in this area at some undetermined time. The entire phase of handling the evidence and initial suspects clearly reflected the fragility of investigative directions built on inference rather than evidence, as each small clue was overly expected but lacked the strength to withstand rigorous legal scrutiny, causing the investigation team to continually adjust expectations and accept the reality that although they had advanced a step beyond the pure search phase, the case still lacked sufficient data to shift to a conclusive handling direction, and it was precisely the absence of legal grounds to process the suspect in this phase that set clear limits for the investigation, forcing the investigators to weigh between continuing to pursue unproven hypotheses and acknowledging that the tools available to them were not yet sufficient to clarify Stephen Allen's fate at that point. After the physical evidence could not be bolstered by authenticated data and the potential suspect was not tied to any direct evidence, the investigation gradually entered a phase where continued efforts no longer produced substantial progress, as for many consecutive days, no new clues emerged that were strong enough to alter the current assessment, and all information received was repetitive, speculative, or based on memories that had faded over time. Making verification increasingly difficult, the areas previously searched during the wide-scale phase were selectively re-examined, but yielded no different results. Any additional witness statements, if they existed, merely repeated what had already been recorded without adding a decisive element, creating the sense that the case had reached the limit of what could be gathered using current methods. In the absence of new data, the investigative team was forced to gradually eliminate the main hypotheses that had been proposed from the beginning. The possibility that Stephen wandered off on his own and met with an accident was re-evaluated, based on the search results that found no traces within a reasonable range for a 5-year-old child, while the hypothesis of an accident near the living area became less convincing as dangerous locations had been thoroughly checked multiple times without finding evidence, and the hypothesis of third-party involvement, though not completely ruled out, could not be elevated to the primary investigative direction due to the lack of elements constituting a criminal act under legal standards. This elimination process did not occur as a decisive action, but as a gradual adjustment in the investigator's perception, as each possibility was reconsidered in light of what had and had not been found, leading to a suspended state in which no hypothesis was strong enough to pursue to the end, yet none was weak enough to be fully discarded. Parallel to narrowing the investigative directions, the initial suspect also reached a clear limit, as although this person had once been considered a person of interest due to their presence and certain behaviors deemed unusual, the verification process yielded no physical evidence, independent witnesses, or serious contradictions in statements that could serve as grounds for detention or prosecution, while checks on travel history and social relationships were insufficient to prove direct involvement in Stephen's disappearance, making continued focus on this suspect not only ineffective but also potentially risky from legal and ethical standpoints for the investigating agency. The inability to hold the suspect while also failing to identify an alternative placed the investigative team in a position with no specific target to pursue, a particularly awkward state in child disappearance cases, where the pressure to find answers always coincides with the responsibility to avoid wrongful accusations, and when active investigative measures no longer produced results, the focus of work gradually shifted to maintaining the file, periodic reviews, and waiting for new information from external sources. During this phase, resources allocated to the case began to decline noticeably, not due to lack of concern, but due to the reality that local agencies had to distribute personnel across multiple cases, with those showing clear criminal signs or higher solvability often prioritized, while Stephen's disappearance, after undergoing initial processing without progress, was gradually categorized as a long-term monitoring file, rather than one requiring immediate intervention. The reduction in resources was evident not only in the number of personnel directly involved, but also in the frequency of file reviews, the proactivity in seeking new leads, and the ability to expand the investigation to other areas or methods, causing the case to enter a state of professional stagnation. For Stephen's family, this change was felt as a growing distance between their personal grief and the investigative machinery, as the intense initial search activities were gradually replaced by sparse procedural updates, while for the investigative team, this was a difficult phase both professionally and psychologically, as they had to confront the reality that despite deploying measures within their capabilities and the conditions of the time, the case still did not progress as desired. The investigation stalemate was thus not the result of a single error, but the consequence of multiple combined factors, from limitations in initial data, constraints of search methods, time pressure, to the social and legal context of the era, all converging to create an unofficial stopping point, where the case was not declared closed but no longer driven by active investigative actions. In this state, the Stephen Allen file existed as a collection of unproven hypotheses, unconnectable clues, and unanswered questions, reflecting a familiar reality in many child disappearance cases of that period, when the lack of tools and information caused the search for truth to stall, not due to lack of effort, but because it had reached the limit of what could be done within the existing framework. The prolonged stalemate of the investigation did not lead to a clear declaration of closure, but quietly created a shift in how the system approached the case, where active investigative activities were gradually reduced to a minimum and replaced by administrative maintenance procedures, reflecting the reality that all feasible directions under current conditions had been explored without achieving a breakthrough, thereby shifting Stephen Allen's disappearance from being treated as an emergency, requiring immediate response, to long-term monitoring status. This decision formed through multiple internal evaluations, in which investigators and agency leaders had to confront the limitations of collected data, the absence of new leads, and legal constraints that made maintaining the initial investigative intensity no longer appropriate, especially in the context of limited resources and other cases requiring more urgent intervention, leading to Stephen Allen's case being removed from the high-priority list without a formal decision announced to the public. Alongside this change, the case file was reviewed and completed according to storage standards, with field reports, interrogation transcripts, search notes, lists of suspects previously considered, and professional assessments compiled into a unified set of documents to ensure that the entire initial investigative process was preserved to the maximum extent. However, this archiving primarily served administrative purposes rather than preparation for a future reinvestigation, as the documents were created in a context lacking high standardization, relying heavily on individual note-taking, and not designed for easy reanalysis using different methods. Along with the file being moved to storage, direct responsibility for the case was also transferred from the initial investigative team to the general file management system, where the case existed as an entry in the list of unsolved incidents, no longer tied to the name or initiative of a specific investigator. This transfer marked a significant organizational change, as the case was no longer driven by personal commitment, but maintained only through passive monitoring mechanisms, dependent on the emergence of new information from external sources. For Stephen Allen's family, this change was felt clearly through direct exchanges with the investigating agency becoming infrequent, and then nearly ceasing, with updates once anticipated daily or weekly gradually replaced by prolonged silence, not because the case had been resolved, but because there was nothing new to report, creating an ever-widening gap between the family's personal pain and the official system process, where maintaining contact was seen as necessary only when there was specific progress. In that context, the family was no longer viewed as an active part of the investigative process, but became bystanders waiting on the sidelines, accessing information mainly through procedural responses if they proactively reached out, while the case itself gradually gathered dust in storage, among hundreds or thousands of other files in similar states, awaiting a strong enough change factor to regain attention on the part of the authorities. Shifting the case to cold case status was not seen as a failure, but as a practical adjustment, acknowledging that current tools and methods were insufficient to resolve it, while retaining the possibility of returning in the future, if scientific, technological, or informational context changed. However, in actual operations, this acknowledgement also meant the case gradually moved out of the daily workflow, as new investigators lacked direct memory of the case, and approached it only as an old set of documents without clear guidance on next steps. Storing the file under the conditions of that era also carried long-term consequences, as much important information existed in handwritten notes, without unified classification systems, and lacking connections between data parts, making future reconstruction of the entire investigative process heavily dependent on the interpreter's ability, while increasing the risk of important details being overlooked or misinterpreted during handover. Cold case status was thus not just a classification label, but an operational reality, in which Stephen Allen's case continued to exist within the justice system, but was no longer driven by specific actions, with all possibilities for progress suspended, and dependent on factors beyond the control of those directly involved, from random information to shifts in system priorities. For the family, this transition marked a new phase full of uncertainty, where hope was no longer tied to specific search campaigns or investigative activities, but existed as a prolonged state of waiting, without timelines, without a roadmap, and without clear commitments from the authorities. While questions about Stephen's fate remained as vivid as on the first day, unanswered and unsoothed, the entire process of the case becoming a cold case thus reflected a structural moment, rather than an event, where the system chose to preserve information instead of continuing action, accepting organized silence as a temporary solution, and placing Stephen Allen's disappearance in an intermediate space between memory and the present, between responsibility and helplessness, where it would remain for many years to come without clear signs of when, or how, it might be awakened again. The prolonged silence of the investigative file paralleled another reality, forming in a place where Stephen Allen was no longer called by his own name, where the 5-year-old boy vanished from his familiar world, and began to exist under a new identity, not tied to his old family's memories, without continuity in paperwork or personal history, defined only by current circumstances and those around him. This identity was not the result of a choice, but a default state imposed, causing Stephen's life from that point onward to function as if the past had never existed, without stories of origin, without official links to the place he was born, or the people who had searched for him. The new living environment Stephen was brought into was completely different from the old family and community space, a more informationally closed environment, but stable enough to create a sense of normal daily life, where he was raised as another child in the new family or care system, learning to adapt to habits, rules and relationships without prior attachment memories. This adaptation occurred not through conscious comparison, but through the reflexes of a child still too young to fully comprehend the rupture that had just happened, making integration happen on the surface, enough to maintain daily life, but not enough to fill the deeper void in identity. The caregiving conditions in the new environment did not necessarily involve obvious violence or instability, but were also not built on a foundation of transparency regarding origin and personal rights. Stephen grew up with basic care meeting survival and physical development needs, fed, educated, and living within permitted frameworks. Yet this care did not include providing information about his biological family or initial circumstances, creating a type of upbringing focused on the present while ignoring the past, leaving questions about himself without the opportunity to form or be clearly answered. During the growth process, the absence of origin information did not immediately manifest as a problem, as the new identity was sufficient for Stephen to participate in basic social activities, attend school, make friends, and form relationships in common patterns. But small gaps began to appear at the intersections between paperwork systems and personal experience, where questions about birthplace, family, medical history, or important life milestones could not be fully answered. Any responses provided, if any, were vague or contradictory, not enough to create a seamless picture of himself. The lack of origin information thus was not just a data deficiency, but gradually became a structural element in Stephen's life, affecting how he viewed himself and his place in the surrounding world, even if not named or clearly recognized. As there were no specific memories for comparison or contrast, the sense of displacement existed at a background level, not erupting into crisis, but also not disappearing, like a silent void that Stephen learned to live with without tools to fill it. The new living environment also shaped how Stephen understood family and attachment, as relationships were built based on current presence rather than shared history, creating an outward sense of stability, but lacking depth and memory-based connection. This did not cause obvious disruption in daily life, but left unspoken questions about why he lacked family stories, like those around him, why important life milestones were not fully recorded, and why basic personal information always existed in the form of guesses or approximations. In that context, Stephen developed his own adaptation mechanisms, learning to accept incomplete answers and avoid delving into questions no one was willing to answer, an adaptation that maintained short-term psychological stability, but simultaneously reinforced the state of living detached from his true origins, making the new identity not just an external shell, but gradually the only reality he knew. The lack of origin information also affected how agencies and organizations approached Stephen throughout his growth, as administrative records were built on incomplete but sufficient data to operate the system, not triggering serious suspicion because such gaps were not uncommon in special circumstances. This allowed Stephen's life to continue without interruption from external questions, while reinforcing the separation between his real identity and the one used. This entire phase thus reflected a life built on a foundation of absence, where Stephen existed and developed as a functionally independent individual, but without access to the full story of himself, a state that did not cause immediate collapse but accumulated over time, creating an increasingly clear distance between the current person and the unconnected past, while elsewhere, the Stephen Allen file remained dormant in storage. Two parallel realities continuing to exist without intersection, each operating according to its own logic, completely unaware of the other's presence. Life under the new identity continued to flow onward, and over time, Stephen entered the early stages of adulthood in circumstances where outward stability concealed a foundation lacking cohesion, as he grew up like a normal child within the framework of the new family and environment, participating in education, daily activities, and social interactions according to the common rhythm, but the entire process unfolded without a continuous anchor of memories from the early years, causing Stephen's childhood to be constructed as a series of events that began late, without a clear introduction, without a background story passed down, existing only as fragmented pieces sufficient to maintain a sense of normalcy, but not enough to create wholeness in identity. In the new family environment, relationships were formed based on present presence and functional roles rather than bonds from shared memories. Stephen learned to use names, follow rules, and adapt to the expectations of those around him. But this bonding lacked the historical depth, typically formed from shared experiences in early childhood, making family relationships stable in structure but limited in emotional depth, not manifesting as clear conflicts, but also not creating a complete sense of belonging, a liminal state that Stephen had no language to express, but sensed through subtle differences between himself and other children in the same environment. The memory gap regarding the early life stage did not appear as a specific loss, but as an inaccessible foggy region, where Stephen had no clear images of the early years, no recollection of faces, places, or sensations associated with early childhood, and when questions about the past arose in educational or social contexts, answers were often generic, memorized, or guessed, not stemming from personal experience, creating a disconnect between what was told and what was truly felt. The lack of continuous memory gradually became a factor, influencing how Stephen perceived time and himself, as important life milestones were not anchored in specific experiences, but existed only as administrative information or disjointed stories, making the formation of a unified personal narrative difficult. And although this did not hinder basic learning or integration abilities, it created a silent sense of uncertainty, where Stephen could not fully determine where he came from and what that meant for his current self. In social relationships outside the family, Stephen demonstrated good behavioral adaptability, knowing how to follow norms, communicate, and participate in group activities, but simultaneously maintained a certain emotional distance, sharing little about himself, and avoiding topics related to family or the past, not because of anything consciously needing to be hidden, but because there was not enough information to share confidently. This reserve gradually became a personality trait, helping Stephen avoid awkward situations, but also reinforcing a sense of separation from relationships based on deep empathy. The feeling of disconnection, therefore, did not manifest as rebellion or overt crisis, but seeped gradually into small details of daily life, from the sense of not fully belonging in family gatherings, to difficulty answering simple questions about origins, and uncertainty when facing situations requiring self-identification in a broader context. These manifestations were often overlooked or explained as personal quirks, not severe enough to attract attention or external intervention. In the early maturation process, Stephen learned to navigate the surrounding world by relying on what was available rather than pursuing what was missing, focusing on the present and near future to avoid confronting unanswerable questions, an effective short-term adaptation strategy, but one that simultaneously left identity gaps unaddressed, merely pushed aside, existing as the underlying foundation of lived experience. The new family relationship, while providing necessary stability, also did not encourage delving into the past. Questions about origins, if raised, were often answered in simplified or evasive ways, reinforcing the implicit message that focusing on the present was more important than pursuing what was gone. And Stephen internalized this message as a survival rule, learning not to ask more and not to expect beyond what was provided. Over time, the combination of memory gaps, family relationships lacking historical depth, and an avoidance-based adaptation strategy created a childhood disrupted in structure rather than in events, where experiences existed but did not connect into a seamless flow, causing Stephen to grow up with the feeling of being a functionally complete individual, but lacking a background story to fully understand himself. a condition that did not cause immediate crisis, but shaped how he viewed the world and his place in it. This entire phase thus reflected a maturation process occurring in the absence of elements typically taken for granted in childhood, when family, memory, and identity did not align naturally, but existed as pieces that did not fully fit, creating a silent but persistent sense of disconnection that followed Stephen through his early years, without clear signs indicating its origin, nor tools to explain or resolve it, making his childhood not shattered by a specific event, but disrupted by the very lack of connection between past and present. The silent disconnection of the disrupted childhood gradually manifested as specific anomalies, as Stephen delved deeper into social spaces, requiring documentation for authentication, where identity was no longer just a matter of address in family or school, but became a set of data to be cross-checked, stored, and retrieved. And it was here that the deficiencies previously concealed by daily routines began to emerge clearly. Stephen's personal records existed but were incomplete. The foundational documents used to confirm identity were sufficient for minimal operation, but lacked historical depth. Some important documents had no originals, existing only as copies or declared information. Timelines were recorded discontinuously, creating gaps without accompanying explanations, and in many cases, determining the origin of the data became vague, making the records meet formal requirements, but unable to withstand rigorous scrutiny. This incompleteness initially caused no major obstacles, as administrative systems in many cases allowed exceptions if minimum criteria were met, especially for individuals with special circumstances. However, over time, as Stephen approached procedures requiring deeper verification, these shortcomings began to create bottlenecks, forcing additional information or explanations for differences that he himself could not clarify. In addition to the lack in quantity and completeness of documents, the personal information in Stephen's records also contained inexplicable contradictions, from small details like differing places of birth across documents, to mismatched timelines regarding residency registration or guardian changes. These contradictions were not severe enough to immediately trigger investigation, but sufficient to create unease when viewed together, especially for those experienced in handling records, as they indicated a chain of information built in patched layers, rather than a seamless process recorded from the start. Explaining these contradictions often relied on generic reasons, such as administrative errors, lost documents, or family circumstance changes, reasons that were not uncommon, and thus rarely suspected, but for Stephen, they accumulated into a repeating pattern, where each answer resolved only a small part of the issue, without illuminating the whole picture, making contradiction a permanent state, rather than an exception. The legal gaps in Stephen's personal records, thus, were not just absent data, but a lack of connection between existing facts, a gap that made determining rights, obligations, and legal history more difficult than usual, as decisions related to personhood often relied on time-verified chains of information, while Stephen's records provided only disjointed points insufficient to draw a clear straight line, creating gray areas where the system had to accept imperfection to continue functioning. In many situations, the existence of these legal gaps did not lead to outright rejection, but forced Stephen to follow more complex paths, requiring additional confirmations, or accepting certain limitations, an experience that made him more aware of the difference between himself and those with seamless records, though still without enough information to understand the deeper cause of that difference. The ability to retrieve personal history was also a prominent issue, as efforts to search for information about Stephen's early life yielded no concrete results. Databases had no fully matching records, archival agencies could only provide information from a certain point onward, leaving an unfillable gap by ordinary means, and each query only further confirmed the reality that Stephen's past, at least on paper, did not exist in the way the system expected. This inability to retrieve history gradually became a reality Stephen had to accept, as no agency or individual was directly responsible for clarifying it. Any answers were speculative or general guidance, insufficient to create a legal or psychological anchor, making the search for origins a vague journey, without a clear path. In that context, Stephen's personal records functioned like a structure without a foundation, sturdy enough in normal conditions, but prone to instability under strong verification pressures, and this fragility created prolonged unease, as every step forward in life carried the potential to be halted by questions he could not answer. The anomalies in the records, thus, were not just administrative issues, but gradually became a factor shaping lived experience, influencing how Stephen approached important decisions, from choosing educational and career paths to building relationships, as each choice had to consider invisible limits imposed by the incomplete records. Notably, although these anomalies were clear from a systemic perspective, they were not prominent enough to automatically trigger deep review, as each deficiency could be explained individually, and did not directly violate current regulations, creating a state in which the truth, if it existed, was obscured by the superficial validity of the records. This entire phase thus reflected how an identity built on a data-deficient foundation could persist long-term in the system without decisive challenge, as gaps were filled by assumptions and administrative flexibility, allowing life to continue, but simultaneously locking access to the true past, leaving Stephen to live in a present validated by documents, but without a clear path back to his own origins, a condition stable enough to endure yet anomalous enough to create a sense that something fundamental was missing, that no one could, or was willing to name. The anomalies existing in the personal records did not prevent Stephen from continuing forward along the path society laid out for an adult, as at the level of daily functioning, the identity he used remained valid enough to open necessary doors for education and career, allowing him to complete basic education, choose a direction suited to his abilities and conditions, and gradually build a stable position in the work environment, where achievements, discipline, and perseverance were valued more than background stories, enabling Stephen to integrate and develop without excessive questioning about the past. His educational path proceeded at a steady pace, not outstanding, but also without serious obstacles. Administrative requirements were met with available documents, arising questions were resolved through additional procedures or system flexibility, creating conditions for him to complete necessary milestones and enter professional life with a sufficiently solid foundation, where practical skills and work attitude gradually became the primary identifiers rather than personal records. In the workplace, Stephen built credibility based on stability and adaptability, choosing positions that did not require deep scrutiny of personal history, focusing on maintaining income and long-term sustainability, avoiding risks that could trigger complex verification processes, a strategy not entirely conscious, but gradually becoming habit, reflecting how he learned to live with the invisible limits of the identity he carried. Alongside career development, Stephen formed his own family, building relationships based on the present and future rather than the past, where bonds were created from shared experiences, responsibility, and commitment, not needing deep background stories to maintain stability. His new family operated according to the logic of adult life, with work, children, social relationships, and practical goals, creating a sense of normalcy and functional completeness. In the roles of partner and father, Stephen demonstrated dedication and responsibility, striving to provide the family with what he could control, compensating for the deficiencies he had experienced through presence and stability, an effort not reactive, but stemming from the desire to build a solid reality, where questions about origins no longer dominated daily life. The outward stability of this adult life concealed most of the anomalies once present in the personal records, as the system Stephen interacted with in this phase prioritized continuity and efficiency over tracing history, allowing him to exist and develop without interruption, while reinforcing the sense that the past, though vague, did not necessarily need clarification for life to function. However, this very stability also created a paradox, as the more he built a seemingly solid life, the farther the ability to access the truth about personal origins became, since delving into record gaps meant questioning the legal and emotional foundation of what had been built, a risk Stephen lacked sufficient information and motivation to accept. Sporadic efforts to understand the past, if they occurred, usually stopped at probing levels, not pursued fully, due to lack of data, lack of anchors, and lack of a clear path to follow, each approach leading to familiar system dead ends, where generic answers confirmed no additional information was available, reinforcing the sense that the truth, if it existed, was buried beyond ordinary reach. In that context, Stephen chose to continue living with the current identity as an unchangeable reality, focusing on maintaining stability for himself and family, accepting that his past might forever remain unexplained, an acceptance not entirely comfortable, but sufficient to avoid major disruption in life. The inaccessibility to truth thus did not manifest as crisis or aggressive searching, but existed as a silent foundation, influencing how Stephen made decisions, choosing safer paths over risks, avoiding situations that could expose questions he could not answer, and maintaining a certain distance between himself and topics related to origins or family history. Stephen's adult life, under a different identity, thus took the shape of a functionally complete structure, but lacking depth of connection in origins, where social roles were fully performed, but the personal story lacked a clear beginning, creating a conditional peace dependent on not disturbing the sediment layers of the past. This peace was maintained over many years through the alignment between personal needs and system operations, allowing Stephen to exist as an ordinary citizen, worker, husband and father, without directly confronting the anomalies once noted in the records. But that very alignment also firmly locked the door to truth, as no factor was strong enough to force the system or himself to radically re-question. This entire adult phase reflected a life built on adaptation and acceptance, where the current identity became the only reliable reality, while the past existed as a gap enveloped by outward stability, not causing collapse but also not filled, allowing Stephen to move forward with a personal story complete in form, but never fully accessed in truth. The outward stability of Stephen's life existed alongside another reality that was quietly shifting in the field of criminal investigation, where science began to provide new tools capable of piercing through the gaps that traditional methods had been powerless against, and this very development gradually changed the way the system viewed cases that seemed to have quietly settled into archives. Forensic DNA, from being merely an experimental concept, became a scientific foundation capable of identifying individuals with unprecedented accuracy, ushering in a new era for criminal investigations, especially in cases without direct witnesses, without confessions, and lacking clear physical evidence, where DNA allowed connections between people and the past through biological traces rather than memories or statements. Along with the refinement of analysis techniques, DNA databases began to be built and expanded, enabling comparisons and matches between biological samples collected from old crime scenes with data from individuals involved in the legal system or who voluntarily provided information, creating the ability to detect connections that were previously unimaginable. And this capability changed the way law enforcement agencies assessed the value of files once classified as dead ends. In that context, the concept of a cold case no longer meant accepting permanent silence, but became a potential candidate for re-examination, especially in cases involving missing children, where the identity of the victim and the perpetrator could be clarified through biological connections rather than traditional evidence. This shift prompted many investigative units to begin reviewing old files to identify cases that could benefit from new technology. The Stephen Allen file, though it had lain dormant in storage for many years, gradually came back into focus in that context, not because of new leads from outside, but because the structure of the case contained elements suitable for DNA-based investigation methods, including the victim disappearing as a child, no conclusion confirming death, and large gaps in identity within the system. These factors made the case a potential candidate for applying modern biological tracing techniques. The process of reviewing the file did not happen as a sudden turning point, but as the result of strategic assessments, in which investigators and forensic experts weighed the value of each file based on the potential existence of exploitable biological evidence, the preservation level of related materials, and the potential for connection to existing databases. The Stephen Allen file, despite lacking many physical elements, still retained some data sufficient to raise questions about the possibility of using DNA as an identification tool. Parallel to the development of direct DNA analysis techniques, genealogical DNA methods also began to prove their value, allowing the tracing of biological relationships through distant relatives, rather than requiring direct samples from the individual to be identified. This method was particularly suitable for long-term missing persons cases, where the victim might still be alive under a different identity, unaware of the existence of a legal file tied to their real name, and this capability opened up an entirely new approach to cases once seen as having no point of contact. Within the investigative system, the emergence of modern DNA tools brought about changes in mindset, from focusing on proving criminal acts to identifying individuals and biological connections, a shift that allowed cases without clear perpetrators to still progress by clarifying the core question about the person. And in the case of Stephen Allen, that question was not who did what, but where Stephen Allen is, and whether he still exists. The decision to review the Stephen file was based not only on scientific potential, but also reflected a change in how the system valued delayed justice, when clarifying the truth, even after many decades, was still seen as meaningful for the victim, the family, and society, creating motivation to invest resources in cases once left behind. In the consideration process, risk factors were also raised, including the possibility that evidence was no longer of sufficient quality for analysis, the risk of not finding a match in the database, and the legal and ethical consequences of reopening a case that had existed in silence for too long. However, these risks were deemed acceptable in the context where the potential benefits of identifying the individual outweighed maintaining ambiguity. From those assessments, the decision to use DNA as the central tool to reapproach the case was formed, marking an important shift in the approach to the Stephen Allen file, from waiting for random information to actively seeking answers through science, a decision not emotional, but based on the combination of technical progress and new awareness of the system's responsibility toward unsolved cases. This decision also reflected the belief that science could serve as a bridge between the parallel realities that had existed for many years, one side being the legal file, bearing the name Stephen Allen lying dormant in storage, and the other, the adult life of a man living under a different identity, unaware that his past had once been recorded and searched for. And precisely at that potential intersection, DNA science was expected to do what traditional investigative methods could not, opening the possibility of reconnecting the pieces separated by time, not through memory or testimony, but through the most objective and enduring biological traces of humans. The decision to use DNA as the central tool forced the investigative system to return to the starting point in a completely different way, not to find more witnesses or reconstruct the scene, but to review the entire archived file, from a scientific perspective, where the value of each document no longer lay in its ability to recount the story, but in its potential to provide biological data or background information for matching. This process began with gathering all documents related to Stephen Allen's disappearance, from initial reports, interrogation records, search notes, to physical evidence once collected, but never exploited with modern methods. Each component examined, not for what it once said, but for what it might still retain after many decades. The review of archived files proceeded systematically, with the goal of identifying data gaps that could be filled by new technology and potential intersections between old files and modern databases. In this process, investigators and forensic experts had to confront the reality that most documents were created in a context lacking standardization, many notes personal in nature, without unified structure, and not always clearly explaining the logic behind decisions made. This required careful interpretation to avoid imposing modern assumptions on evaluations formed in a very different context. Parallel to reviewing texts, the focus gradually shifted to determining whether any physical evidence still existed in conditions suitable for DNA testing, because not all evidence carries biological value, and not all biological samples have long-term preservation capability. Items once collected in the past were reinventoried, evaluated based on material, storage conditions, and likelihood of direct contact with Stephen. This process was more about exclusion than expectation, as most evidence did not meet technical requirements, or had degraded over time. Selecting suitable evidence thus became a critical step, requiring close coordination between investigators and forensic experts to determine which samples were most likely to provide reliable biological information. The criteria set included not only the presence of DNA, but also direct relevance to the victim, avoiding samples at risk of cross-contamination, or unable to have their origin confirmed with certainty, because an unclear or erroneous result could have serious consequences for the entire investigative process. In that context, preparing for DNA testing was not merely a technical operation, but a strategic evaluation process, where each decision had to weigh potential benefits against accompanying risks. Selected samples had to undergo preliminary checks to determine preservation level, extraction potential, and degradation risk, while handling procedures were designed to minimize the chance of damaging the sample, because with evidence existing from decades ago, each intervention could be the last opportunity. Parallel to technical work, the investigative team assessed risks of possible outcomes, not only scientifically, but also operationally and legally. The possibility of not obtaining usable DNA was seen as a high probability scenario, meaning the case could return to deadlock despite significant resource investment, while the chance of obtaining ambiguous or hard-to-interpret results also posed the risk of leading to wrong directions, if not handled cautiously. Another risk considered was that DNA results, if obtained, could lead to discoveries not in initial predictions, such as identifying biological connections to individuals not appearing in the old file, or raising new legal questions related to privacy, consent, and impact on people not directly involved in the case. These consequences required the investigative team to prepare response plans to avoid unnecessary harm. In the risk assessment process, the time factor was also considered, because reactivating old data was not just a scientific effort, but an intervention into realities that had existed stably for many years. Each step forward could bring major changes to involved individuals, from Stephen's family to the person who might be Stephen under a different identity. Though at this point, those consequences still existed only as theoretical possibilities. Preparing for DNA testing was thus carried out with the highest caution, not placing absolute expectations on results, but viewing it as a tool that could open opportunities, while accepting that failure was also a valid outcome in the search for truth. This approach reflected the maturity of the modern investigative system, where science is used as a decision support means rather than a certain promise. The entire process of reactivating old data was thus more about restructuring than repetition, not aiming to reenact previous investigative steps, but to place them in a new analytical framework, where each piece of information was re-evaluated for biological value and connection potential, creating a different foundation for approaching the Stephen Allen case. a foundation not based on human memory or speculative hypotheses, but on science's objective ability to determine connections between people and the past. And at this point, old data was no longer just the legacy of a failed investigation, but became a potential resource for an entirely new approach, where the answer, if it exists, would not come from asking more questions, but from rereading what time seemed to have erased. The re-evaluation of old data from a scientific perspective created a solid enough basis for the Stephen Allen file to be officially moved out of passive storage status and placed in the hands of a specialized unit. The cold case unit received the case not as a new file, but as a complex structure that had accumulated many layers of time, requiring a more systematic and disciplined approach than the initial investigation phase. This handover involved redefining the core objective of the case, no longer focusing on searching at the scene or pursuing suspects through traditional methods, but prioritizing clarifying the victim's identity and journey through verifiable data. The first step in the reopening process was reconstructing the entire case timeline from the beginning to the point when the file was turned into a cold case, a task requiring synthesis and standardization of information from many scattered sources, in which initial reports, witness statements, search records, physical evidence, and operational decisions were placed back into a unified timeline, eliminating unfounded assumptions and clearly distinguishing between confirmed facts and speculations once accepted due to lack of alternatives. This process was not aimed at criticizing previous decisions, but at understanding the operational logic of the investigation in that era's context. Reconstructing the timeline also allowed the cold case unit to identify critical breaking points, where information was missing, contradictory, or never clarified, from the last time Stephen was seen to the search phases, evidence handling, and suspect evaluation. Each breaking point recorded as a node to be re-examined with modern tools, rather than overlooked as unfillable gaps. Parallel to restructuring the timeline, old data was directly compared with possibilities provided by current science. Evidence once deemed insufficient was re-evaluated for biological potential. Notes on personal background and social relationships were placed alongside modern databases to search for matches, and hypotheses once discarded due to lack of evidence were reconsidered from a probability perspective rather than certainty, creating a comprehensive picture where old data no longer stood alone, but was connected to new sources of information. This comparison process also clarified the fundamental difference between the two investigative phases, when data once seen as conclusive in the old context, now only served as a starting point for new questions. The cold case unit did not seek to reconfirm every prior finding, but actively classified them into elements to retain, adjust, or completely discard, based on compatibility with current scientific tools and operational standards. From that foundation, a new investigative plan was established with clear structure and specific objectives, prioritizing steps capable of generating objective data rather than relying on statements or inference. This plan included identifying biological samples suitable for testing, building strategies for direct and indirect DNA matching, reviewing personal records, with unusual signs fitting Stephen's age and circumstances, and establishing handling scenarios corresponding to each possible type of result. Establishing the plan also came with risk control principles, to ensure every step was carried out within legal and ethical frameworks, especially when the possibility of discovering an individual still alive under a different identity was raised. The cold case unit had to prepare for consequences not only investigative but also human, from approaching information to protecting the privacy of those potentially affected. In the file reopening process, coordination between specialized departments was strengthened. Investigators, forensic experts, data analysts, and legal advisors all participated in shaping the direction, ensuring the plan was not dominated by a single perspective. This coordination also helped avoid repeating limitations that existed in the initial investigation, where decisions were often made under conditions of incomplete information and time pressure. Reopening the Stephen Allen file was thus not just an administrative action, but a comprehensive restructuring of the case approach, shifting the focus from reacting to events to proactively seeking truth through tools capable of overcoming the limits of memory and time, each step placed within an overall plan to maximize the chance of obtaining meaningful results, while accepting that this process could be prolonged and not guarantee immediate success. The entire phase reflected a fundamental change in how the system confronted old cases, where reopening was no longer seen as an exceptional action, but as part of long-term responsibility. And for the Stephen Allen file, this reopening marked the first time in many decades that the case was truly placed back into a state of motion, not by returning to old scenes or repeating already asked questions, but by building a new investigative roadmap based on data, science, and the ability to connect information pieces that once existed separately, creating a solid foundation for the next steps in the journey to find the truth. The new data platform and investigation plan allowed the cold case unit to move into the most sensitive and decisive phase since the Stephen Allen file was reopened. Reverse identity tracing through genetic genealogy, a method that does not seek direct matches, but traces indirect biological connections to reconstruct the path leading to a specific individual in the real world. This process marked a clear shift from handling records to approaching a human being, although at this stage, all results remained internal and were not yet linked to any public identity. The available DNA samples after technical analysis were uploaded to expanded matching systems where they were compared against millions of voluntary profiles and existing data to identify partial matches. These matches did not immediately reveal the victim's identity, but only indicated distant blood relationships, possibly many generations removed. Yet from these fragile connections, forensic genealogy experts began building structured assumptions about Stephen's biological origins, with each match treated as a small piece that held no independent meaning but gained value when placed in the overall picture. Constructing the hypothetical family tree required combining DNA data with social and geographical information, since determining blood relationships cannot be separated from historical and population migration contexts. Family branches were mapped out and cross-referenced with residences, birth dates, and key life milestones to assess the likelihood of a child born in the early 1950s existing without a clear history in the system. This work was more about exclusion than confirmation, as numerous possibilities were considered and then eliminated based on incompatible criteria. Parallel to the genetic genealogy analysis, the investigation team traced birth records and related civil documents for children recorded in the appropriate time period and region, focusing particularly on those with irregularities, such as late birth registrations, changes in guardian information, or appearances in the system without complete prior history. This tracing was not aimed at finding a perfect record, but at detecting patterns of discrepancy that might reflect a child being entered into the system under a different identity, a phenomenon not uncommon in the civil administration context of decades past. Cross-referencing between biological data and administrative records gradually revealed convergence, as certain cases stood out due to significant compatibility in age, living area, early life gaps, and indirect family connections suggested by DNA. These cases were not treated as conclusions, but as candidates requiring deeper examination, and it was here that the list of possibilities began to be narrowed in a controlled manner. The narrowing process occurred through multiple rounds of evaluation, each requiring additional verification to avoid the trap of early confirmation. Candidates were cross-checked based on geographical data, migration history, family circumstances, and minor details in personal records previously deemed unimportant. The goal was not to find a perfect match, but to gradually eliminate cases that could not be reasonably explained by Stephen Allen's disappearance scenario. This method ensured that the final list was not only short, but also highly reliable. When the number of possibilities was reduced to a minimum, identifying the matching subject entered its most delicate phase, where every detail in the record was examined from multiple angles, from biological compatibility to life logic. Timelines, locations, and social relationships had to form a coherent chain if placed in the context of a child who vanished in 1951 and grew up under a different identity. Any major contradiction was enough to remove a candidate from the list, regardless of how high the DNA match level was. In this phase, the cold case unit placed special emphasis on independent confirmation, accepting no conclusion based solely on a single data source. Every piece of information had to be verified from at least 2 different directions to ensure the match was not the result of random coincidence or analytical error. This was a critical safeguard to prevent severe consequences from misidentification, as an error at this stage would not only damage the investigation, but could also profoundly disrupt the life of the person involved. Identifying the matching subject was therefore not seen as a dramatic moment of discovery, but as the convergence point of a prolonged accumulation process, where biological, administrative, and social data gradually overlapped to form a structure solid enough to withstand professional skepticism. That structure revealed a specific individual who fit the Stephen Allen profile to a degree far superior to all other possibilities. Although at this stage, all conclusions remained confidential and not publicly confirmed. Internally, the investigation team had reached a level of certainty sufficient to shift from abstract tracing to preparing for direct verification steps. A pivotal transition, as for the first time in decades, the Stephen Allen case no longer existed solely as records and hypotheses, but was linked to a specific living person leading a complete life under a different identity. The entire reverse identity tracing process reflected the power of combining science and patience, as tiny data fragments, seemingly meaningless in isolation, were connected into a picture capable of piercing through time. Relying not on fragile memories or contradictory statements, but on undeniable biological traces. And at this point, the search for Stephen Allen came closer than ever to answering the core question that had hung unresolved for decades. Even though that answer had not yet been made public, and every subsequent step required absolute caution, the convergence of biological data, administrative records, and genealogy analysis finally reached a threshold where assumptions were no longer sufficient to describe the state of the investigation. As the DNA results obtained after multiple cross-checks showed a match level exceeding all acceptable error margins, not only confirming indirect blood relationships, but also strongly reinforcing the likelihood that the individual under scrutiny was indeed Stephen Allen, the child missing since 1951, this result did not emerge as an isolated discovery, but as the synthesis of multiple independent comparisons, in which DNA samples were matched against different family branches, and all pointed to the same conclusion about biological origin, creating a level of certainty sufficient to move the case to the phase of legal-level identity confirmation. Confirming that Stephen Allen was still alive was not approached as an emotional declaration, but as a professional conclusion requiring maximum caution, since its implications extended beyond resolving a cold case file to directly affecting the life of a person who had existed for decades under a different identity. Therefore, investigators conducted a full review of the entire data chain once more, ensuring no step in the analysis had been overlooked or misinterpreted, with all results placed under the supervision of independent experts, to rule out errors or rare coincidences. Parallel to biological confirmation, the process of completing legal verification was activated to ensure the investigation's conclusion could stand within the framework of the law. Civil records, identity documents, residency data, and materials related to Stephen's current identity were cross-referenced with the original missing person file. Each timeline milestone was placed side by side to check consistency. Gaps that once existed in the personal record were now re-examined in a new light, no longer vague signs of irregularity, but indirect evidence supporting the conclusion that the identity had been changed very early on. Completing legal verification also included assessing implications related to the rights and obligations of the individual identified as Stephen Allen, from current legal status to potential issues with documentation, citizenship and civil relationships established over decades. Legal experts were consulted to ensure all subsequent steps complied with regulations and minimized unnecessary negative impact, especially since the person involved had not actively participated in the initial identity change. Within the investigating agency, the confirmation results were handled under strict confidentiality protocols, not widely disclosed or shared beyond those directly responsible. Internal reports were drafted to document the entire process from file reopening to identity confirmation, ensuring every decision had clear basis and was fully recorded for future steps while creating an important reference document for similar cold cases. Internal notification of the confirmation that Stephen Allen was alive was conducted in a controlled manner, not as a proclamation but as a transfer of responsibility from the investigation phase to post-confirmation handling. Relevant units were updated to prepare for subsequent scenarios, including approaching the individual, managing potential media, and providing necessary legal support, with all plans considered based on the principle of prioritizing human welfare and safety. In this process, investigators faced a rare but weighty reality, a decades-long missing person case, not ending with identifying a perpetrator or discovering remains, but with confirming the victim was still alive, an outcome that raised new questions about approaching justice, system responsibility, and the meaning of resolving a case after so much time had passed. Despite the conclusion reaching high certainty, the investigation team maintained necessary caution, avoiding any actions that could disrupt Stephen's current life before preparations were complete, as identity confirmation did not mean immediate announcements or public actions, but the starting point for a more complex handling phase, where human legal and ethical factors had to be weighed in parallel. The entire identity confirmation process was therefore not seen as the end of the investigation, but as a structural turning point, where the Stephen Allen file for the first time in decades obtained a clear answer to the core question of the victim's existence, while laying the foundation for subsequent decisions on how the system would approach a person who had lived a full life, unaware that their past had been searched for and recorded. A quiet but profoundly meaningful turning point, marking the moment when science, data, and investigative responsibility intersected to confirm that Stephen Allen was not just a name in archives, but a real person still existing in the present. The identity confirmation conclusion placed the investigation team in the most sensitive phase of the entire process, where every step had to be weighed not only by professional standards, but also by direct impact on a person who had lived a full life outside any reference frame of the cold case file. Therefore, the initial contact with Stephen was not viewed as an act of announcing results, but as a gradual, cautious, and controlled approach process to ensure the truth was delivered in the right way, at the right time, and with the minimum necessary intervention. The decision on who would make the initial contact was carefully considered, prioritizing individuals experienced in working with victims in sensitive situations, capable of neutral communication without pressure and without carrying emotional assumptions that could skew the subject's natural response. This approach aimed to avoid putting Stephen on the defensive from the start, as any information related to identity and past could cause strong disruption if presented abruptly. The initial contact did not contain the full truth, but focused on confirming basic information, checking the alignment between investigation data and current reality, and assessing Stephen's initial reaction to verification questions. This reaction was seen as an important indicator for adjusting the next approach strategy, as it revealed the level of readiness to receive information and ability to confront possibilities outside current awareness. Parallel to the initial contact, independent verification continued to ensure all information used in communication was fully checked, avoiding presentation of conclusions that might need later adjustment. The investigation team reviewed data related to Stephen's current life, not to invade privacy, but to understand the social, family, and psychological context in which he existed, as any past information revealed would impact this structure in unpredictable ways. Independent verification also served as a protective layer for Stephen himself, ensuring the approach was not based on unfortified assumptions and avoiding harm. If the conclusion needed last-minute adjustment, thus, different data sources continued to be cross-referenced, from administrative records to genealogy information, to further strengthen certainty before proceeding. When necessary conditions were met, preparations for the meeting were implemented with high detail, not only logistically, but also psychologically and legally. The meeting location was chosen based on neutral, private, and safe criteria, avoiding spaces that might evoke interrogation or power pressure, while ensuring Stephen had a degree of control over the situation, including the right to stop the conversation if uncomfortable. The meeting content was structured in layers of information, not aimed at revealing the full truth at once, but at opening dialogue possibilities, allowing Stephen to approach the information at his own pace. Psychology experts were consulted for recommendations on questioning, responding to various emotional expressions, and handling shock, denial, or avoidance reactions, as each was considered valid and deserving respect in this context. Throughout preparation, the investigation team also evaluated possible response scenarios, from skepticism and refusal to deeper inquiry needs, with each accompanied by handling plans to ensure the meeting did not become a traumatic or imposing event, but a starting point for empowering Stephen's choices in approaching the truth about himself. When the meeting took place, Stephen's reactions were observed and assessed, not to draw investigative conclusions, but to understand how the information was being received. Signs of stress, confusion, or defensiveness were viewed as natural responses to a possibility, shaking foundational awareness, and the approach team maintained a neutral attitude, without pushing, arguing, or seeking immediate persuasion. As the goal was not instant acceptance, but creating a safe space for processing information, reaction assessment did not stop at the meeting, but included monitoring subsequent signals, through pre-agreed communication channels, to ensure Stephen had necessary support, if deciding to continue, or sufficient space, if needing time to process, with all next steps placed under the principle of respecting autonomy and personal pace. Throughout the approach phase, the investigation team continually balanced the responsibility to clarify truth with the duty to protect the person, as identity confirmation only held real meaning if it did not irreversibly shatter the current life. Thus, every action was considered in a long-term context, examining not only immediate reactions, but potential lasting consequences. The victim approach process was therefore not seen as a standard investigative procedure, but as an ethical transition step, where the system for the first time directly confronted the person it had searched for over decades, not as an investigation subject, but as an individual with the right to decide how the truth would enter his life. And at this point, the Stephen Allen case entered a new phase, where the question was no longer whether the truth existed but how that truth would be received and integrated into current life. A question that no science or procedure could answer in place of the person himself. The cautious approach in the previous phase opened up a possibility that for half a century had existed only as a fragile assumption, as the prospect of meeting the biological family was placed on the table as a real possibility rather than a theoretical scenario, and this very shift forced all involved parties to confront a reality whose emotional weight far exceeded any investigative framework, because the reunion was not merely the outcome of a resolved case file, but a direct collision between two life paths that had been separated since 1951. The preparation for meeting the biological family was carried out with the utmost caution, not emphasizing symbolic elements or the moment itself, but focusing on ensuring that both Stephen and the surviving family members were given information in a controlled step-by-step manner to minimize the risk of psychological shock. Initial communication channels with the biological family were established through professional intermediaries to avoid misinformation or sensationalized transmission, because over the years the family had lived with an unresolved loss, and any truth could stir up deep wounds. The meeting took place in a carefully chosen space that ensured privacy, safety, and neutrality, without the appearance of a public event or formal ceremony, but rather as an encounter between people whose blood ties had just been reconnected after a long disconnection. The confirmation of the relationship was based not only on the previously agreed DNA results, but also reinforced through life details, family memories, and similarities that could not be explained by mere coincidence, creating a multi-layered confirmation that was both scientific and human. The initial psychological impact of the reunion did not follow an easily predictable pattern, as the emotions of the parties involved were not simply joy or relief, but a complex mixture of shock, skepticism, emotion, and disorientation. Stephen had to confront the sudden expansion of his personal identity, where strangers carried profound family meaning, while the biological family had to adjust their perception of the child from long ago, who had now become an adult with his own life, memories, and relationships. The gap between the image preserved in memory and the reality before them created a distance that required time to bridge. In the hours and days immediately following the meeting, the psychological reactions of the parties were monitored and supported by experts, not to intervene or direct emotions, but to ensure that no one was left alone with overwhelming inner turmoil. Questions about the past, the reasons for the separation, and the lost years were not forced to be answered immediately, because the goal of this phase was not to fully reconstruct history, but to allow new connections to form on a foundation of safety and voluntariness. Alongside the personal impact, the reunion also brought unavoidable social and media consequences, as a disappearance spanning decades was resolved in a rare way, so media management became an inseparable part of this phase. Relevant agencies coordinated to establish clear confidentiality principles, prioritizing the privacy of Stephen and the biological family over the need for public disclosure. Every decision regarding sharing the story was placed under the consensus of those directly involved, avoiding turning the reunion into an overexploited event. Determining the level of public disclosure was seen as an ongoing process rather than a one-time decision, because the needs and capacity of the parties could change over time. In the initial phase, the focus was on protecting private space, so that new relationships could develop without external pressure, while minimizing the risk of emotionally unprocessed information spreading and causing harm. For Stephen, the reunion posed a particular psychological challenge, as he had to integrate the existence of the biological family into a life already fully built, not by replacement but by expansion, a process requiring emotional flexibility and time, because there was no script guiding how to become a son or sibling in a family one had never known, while still maintaining responsibilities and bonds with the existing family. For the biological family, the reunion did not immediately erase the years of loss, but opened a new phase of adjustment, where the joy of recovery was intertwined with regret. For moments that could not be reclaimed, Stephen's presence in the present was both an answer to long-standing pain and a reminder of the irreversible years that had passed, a reality requiring deeper acceptance than mere celebration. Throughout this phase, the role of agencies and experts was not to lead the story, but to keep it from spiraling out of control, ensuring that the reunion unfolded at a pace suited to the people rather than the logic of the case file or societal expectations. The success of this phase was not measured by the level of publicity or media reaction, but by the ability of the involved parties to maintain psychological stability and self-determination. The reunion after 50 years was thus not a complete ending to a painful journey, but an intersection of many emotional streams and responsibilities, where science and investigation had fulfilled their roles, but people were just beginning to face the hardest part, which was learning to live with the restored truth, a truth no longer confined to files, but present in real people, real relationships, and questions that would take a long time to answer or to accept, that there might never be complete answers. The reunion closed the initial contact phase, but simultaneously opened a much longer and more complex process, where the legal, psychological, and identity consequences began to manifest clearly in the daily lives of Stephen and those involved, because finding the biological family did not mean that all structures existing for decades could immediately adjust to the newly confirmed truth. Legally, Stephen's identity needed to be comprehensively reviewed, not only at the level of recognition, but also in relation to the entire system of documents formed throughout his life. Authorities had to address the challenge of balancing recognition of the true identity with protecting the legal continuity of the identity that had been lawfully used for decades. All adjustments had to be made in a way that minimized disruption, avoiding unwanted consequences related to civil rights, property, legal obligations, and established family relationships. The legal adjustment thus did not occur as a simple replacement, but as a process of fine-tuning, in which Stephen's true identity was officially recorded in the system without negating the legal existence of the old identity, creating a parallel state recognized by law, where past and present coexisted in the records, reflecting the complex reality of his life, rather than forcing it into a linear framework. Alongside these document adjustments, Stephen entered a highly challenging phase of personal adaptation, as the truth about his origins was no longer an abstract possibility, but a present part of his mental life, requiring him to restructure his understanding of himself, family, and personal history. This process did not proceed linearly, but was fluctuating, with periods of clarity and relief interspersed with phases of confusion and fatigue, as integrating the lost past into a stable present created hard-to-name inner conflicts. In daily life, Stephen had to learn to adjust routines and relationships to accommodate the presence of the biological family, not by replacing existing roles or affections, but by expanding emotional space to include new connections, a task far from simple when time, memories, and attachment could not be compensated for solely by biological truth. He had to find his own way to set boundaries, pace, and level of involvement suitable to avoid harming the stability he had built, while not denying the meaning of the newly reconnected relationships. The long-term psychological consequences of the reunion gradually became evident as initial emotions subsided, revealing deeper questions about the lost years, choices not made, and possibilities that never occurred. Stephen had to confront an irreversible sense of regret, a special form of loss, where what was lost was not people but time and experiences. This feeling did not erupt intensely, but persisted, seeping into everyday moments, and requiring long-term psychological processing, rather than short-term reactions. For the biological family, the post-reunion period also carried similar consequences, as the joy of recovering a loved one coexisted with reactivated pain. The years of searching and waiting could not be erased, but were placed in a new context, where the question was no longer where Stephen was but how to move forward with the truth that he had been there, existing, growing up, and forming a different life, a reality requiring deeper acceptance than relief. In that context, the new relationships being built needed time to find stable forms, not dominated by excessive expectations or pressure to compensate for the past. Psychological experts played a supporting role in helping the parties identify and process conflicting emotions, from guilt, anger to anxiety, and fear of loss again, emphasizing that adaptation had no fixed timeline, and did not need to reach an ideal balance to be considered successful. The process of reshaping Stephen's identity occurred in parallel with these adjustments, as he had to confront the fundamental question of who he was in light of the new truth. The identity built on the old name was not denied, but was no longer sufficient to describe the current whole person, while the true identity carried a history and meaning not directly experienced. Combining these elements required a flexible approach, allowing identity to exist as a multi-layered structure, rather than a single definition. This reshaping was not only personal, but also affected how Stephen was perceived in social relationships, where his story, though kept confidential as needed, still had the potential to influence how others understood and interacted with him, forcing Stephen to proactively determine appropriate levels of sharing, protecting privacy, and avoiding being fully defined by an event, however pivotal. In the long term, the post-reunion was not seen as a phase with a clear endpoint, but as an open process in which legal adjustments could be completed relatively quickly, but personal adaptation and identity reshaping continued at their own pace, influenced by new life milestones, developing relationships, and how each party learned to integrate the truth into life, without letting it overshadow the entire present. The entire post-reunion phase thus reflected a truth often overlooked in resolved cold case stories, that finding answers does not mean resolving all consequences. On the contrary, it is often the beginning of a more complex journey, where people must learn to live with the truth rather than just seek it. And in the case of Stephen Allen, that journey took place, not under investigative lights or case file headlines, but in the quiet, persistent adjustments of personal life, where the past had finally been named but still needed a long time to find its proper place in the structure of identity and future. The post-reunion adjustments gradually stabilized personal lives, but did not close all the issues left by the case, because alongside confirming that Stephen Allen was alive and re-establishing family ties was a set of questions still hanging, not easily answered by science or administrative procedures alone. Most prominent among them, the question of the perpetrator, who caused the initial rupture in Stephen's life, a question no longer tied to rescuing the victim, but related to responsibility and justice. The lack of an identified perpetrator reflected the reality that the initial investigation took place in a context limited by tools and standards, where many hypotheses were raised, but could not reach conclusions due to lack of direct evidence, and over time potential traces were eroded or completely disappeared, making tracing the crime much harder than identifying the victim. Although forensic DNA opened a path to clarifying who Stephen was, it did not mean it could determine who caused the disappearance in 1951, because biological connections that reunited the family did not provide direct data on behavior, motive, or circumstances of removing Stephen from the biological family, and in cases without biological evidence linked to the perpetrator, science could not fill that gap on its own. The gaps in the initial investigation became clearer when viewed from the present, not as individual mistakes, but as consequences of a system operating under different conditions, where crime scene preservation was not standardized, evidence recording and storage lacked consistency, and inter-regional coordination was limited. These factors not only reduced the chance of detecting the perpetrator at the time, but also weakened potential for later pursuit when data needed to reconstruct the act was no longer available or reliable enough. The absence of a definite suspect also raised questions about the adequacy of the hypotheses pursued, because in the social context of that era, many scenarios may have been downplayed or dismissed too early for not fitting contemporary perceptions of crime, especially acts involving child identity changes, which were not recognized as organized abduction under modern legal frameworks. This difference meant some potential investigative directions were not fully explored. Systemic responsibility thus became an unavoidable topic when reviewing the case, not to seek belated individual blame, but to assess how decisions, priorities, and limitations of the system shaped the investigation's outcome, from resource allocation, approach to the victim's family, to transitioning the case to cold case status. Each step carried long-term consequences, affecting the ability to clarify the truth in the future. Raising questions about systemic responsibility also opened necessary space for reflection, where law enforcement agencies had to confront the reality that not every late-resolved case could or needed to lead to identifying a perpetrator, especially when too much time had passed and conditions for prosecution no longer existed. In Stephen Allen's case, the central question gradually shifted from who did it to what did the system do and fail to do. To allow the matter to drag on, prosecution limits were a legal and ethical reality that could not be ignored, because even if new suspicions or hypotheses formed after Stephen's identity was confirmed, pursuing criminal responsibility against possibly surviving individuals faced major barriers of evidence, statute of limitations, and legal rights. In many cases, pursuing an unsubstantiated perpetrator could cause more harm than benefit, especially to a victim who had regained a stable life. This limit did not mean denying the importance of the perpetrator question, but reflected balancing the need for justice with legal reality, where the system had to choose actions capable of delivering real value, rather than pursuing symbolic but unenforceable conclusions. In that context, the inability to identify the perpetrator became part of the incomplete story, a gap that could not be filled by unilateral effort. For Stephen, the unanswered questions carried different meaning from the investigative file, because they were not just about abstract justice, but about fully understanding his own life story. The question of who took him from the biological family, and why, might never have a clear answer, but their existence still affected how he viewed the past and his place in it, creating a boundary between what had been clarified and what might have to be accepted as forever unknown. The biological family also had to face this limit, as finding Stephen did not erase the need to understand the cause of the separation, but forced them to accept that not every question could be answered by the legal system, especially when time had faded traces and involved persons might no longer be prosecutable. This acceptance was not easy but necessary to prevent the past from continuing to negatively dominate the present. At the societal level, the Stephen Allen case raised broader questions about how child disappearances were handled, stored, and re-examined. Past gaps became lessons for the present, not only about technology, but also about approach, persistence, and balancing hope with reality. Acknowledging unanswered questions did not diminish the value of what was achieved, but emphasized the need for a system that learns from its own limitations. In that context, unanswered questions were not seen as the final failure of the case, but as an inseparable part of it, reflecting the reality that justice and truth do not always fully align, and resolving a cold case sometimes is not closing every door, but clearly identifying which doors can open and which need to be accepted as forever closed. The entire phase thus placed the Stephen Allen case in an intermediate state, where the achievements of science and investigation had provided the most important answers about existence and identity, but still left gaps regarding cause and responsibility, gaps that could not be filled by individual or singular systemic effort, but existed as reminders of the limits of investigation and the complexity of stories spanning decades, where each achieved answer simultaneously revealed new questions, forcing people and systems to learn to live with that incompleteness. The unanswered questions closed the investigative process with an unavoidable recognition that the Stephen Allen case did not end in the familiar model of closed justice, where every link is connected and every responsibility is named, but that did not diminish the core significance of what was achieved, because at the deepest level of investigative purpose, the case was partially resolved in the most substantive way. The identity and fate of the victim were confirmed. Stephen Allen was no longer a name frozen in a missing persons file, but a living person who had lived a full life under a different identity and was finally returned. The truth about his origins. This resolution did not take the form of a legal judgment or punitive outcome, but existed as a conclusion of confirmation and restoration, where what mattered was not who was convicted, but that the truth lost for half a century was brought back into human life, a form of imperfect justice, but with profound humanistic meaning for the victim and family, confirming that Stephen Allen was alive and reunited with his biological family, closed the central question that had haunted the file for decades: what happened to that 5-year-old child and his fate? This answer, though late, ended the prolonged suspended state that the family had endured, where hope and despair coexisted without solid grounding. From that perspective, the case fulfilled the most basic function of a missing persons investigation, not by restoring the past intact, but by confirming the existence and dignity of the victim in the present. The role of modern science in this process was decisive, because without the development of forensic DNA, and especially genetic genealogy, the Stephen Allen case would very likely still lie dormant in archives as a cold case with no way out. Science not only provided a technical tool, but opened an entirely new way of asking questions. Instead of trying to reconstruct the crime through human memory and faded physical evidence, modern investigation focused on identifying the person through the most enduring biological traces, thereby overcoming the limits of time, forgetting, and inevitable memory distortions. In this case, DNA science did not work as an independent miracle, but was effective in combination with a changed investigative mindset, where cold case units were willing to revisit old files, not to find past mistakes, but to seek new possibilities, placing old data in modern scientific and social contexts, accepting that answers might not lie where they were once sought. The combination of technology, professional discipline, and patient attitude showed that even files, seemingly exhausted of leads, could be reactivated if the system was flexible enough to change its approach. The significance of the Stephen Allen case thus extended beyond the personal or family sphere to the entire field of cold case investigations, especially long-term child disappearances. This case became clear evidence that failing to identify a perpetrator or obtain traditional evidence did not mean all paths were closed, and that preserving files, even under limited conditions, could create long-term value. As investigative technology and methods advanced, every note, report, or seemingly meaningless piece of evidence from the initial time could become a crucial piece in the future. For other cold cases, the greatest lesson lay not in the final outcome, but in the process and goal setting. The Stephen Allen case showed that the purpose of investigation did not always have to be prosecution and conviction, especially when too much time had passed, but could be restoring truth to the extent feasible, returning identity, origins, and the right to know to the victim and family. This approach did not weaken the concept of justice, but expanded it, allowing justice to exist in various forms, depending on context and real limitations. However, in that very confirmatory success, the case also clearly exposed the limits of delayed justice, when time had eroded the ability to pursue criminal responsibility, caused traces necessary to determine the crime to disappear or weaken, and created insurmountable legal barriers. In that context, finding the victim could not fully replace the need for traditional justice, but it forced the system and society to confront the harder question of how justice should be understood when truth could only be partially restored, and pursuing punishment risked causing more harm than benefit. Delayed justice in this case was not a complete victory, but a conscious compromise between what was possible and what was not, where the system chose to focus on outcomes delivering real value to people, rather than pursuing symbolic but unenforceable conclusions. For Stephen Allen, that value lay in being returned his real name, origins, and the right to understand his life story, a value not measurable by a sentence but carrying deep weight in closing a chapter that had lasted half a century. The case also raised reflective questions about systemic responsibility in initial investigations, not to pursue individuals from the past, but to recognize how decisions, priorities, and limitations of an era shaped a case's fate. From crime scene preservation, evidence collection and storage, to transitioning the case to cold case status, each factor left long-term consequences, and only by facing those limitations could the system improve in the present, minimizing the risk of similar gaps in future cases. At the human level, the conclusion of the Stephen Allen case emphasized that resolving a cold case did not mean erasing the losses that occurred. Half a century of separation could not be compensated by any conclusion, but finding the truth prevented those losses from being buried in silence. It allowed the victim and family to place the past in a clearer, though painful, context so they could continue living without being trapped in the state of not knowing. From this angle, partially resolving the case fulfilled a social therapeutic function that traditional law does not always provide. Looking back at the entire journey from the day Stephen Allen disappeared to when his identity was confirmed, the case reflected the overlap of many limitations, from the constraints of the initial investigation, the prolonged silence of the cold case, to the intervention capacity of modern science. No phase could be separated from its historical and social context, and evaluating the case required fairness to both failed efforts and successful advances, because it was the continuity across investigative generations that created the conditions for the final result to emerge. The conclusion of the Stephen Allen case was thus not a definitive full stop, but a conscious pausing point, where what could be done had been done, what could not be done had been named, and the truth, though incomplete, had been placed in its proper position in the lives of those involved. The case was partially resolved, but the resolved part carried the core value of every missing person's investigation, confirming the person and returning to them the right to exist in their own story. In a broader sense, Stephen Allen was no longer just a symbol of a missing child or a long-term cold case file, but became evidence of the system's capacity, when it is willing to revisit, learn, and change, while also serving as a clear reminder of the ineradicable limits of delayed justice, where every achieved answer always comes with remaining questions, and where the ultimate task of investigation is not always to close everything completely, but to take the truth as far as human and legal frameworks allow, then leave the rest to time, acceptance, and the healing capacity of those who had to live too long in the shadow of the unknown. In today's United States, the Stephen Allen story shows that small-town safety is no longer a strong enough shield, and the lessons lie in very specific details. In 1951, the family believed children could play around the house with only distant supervision. The main witness noticed something odd but self-reassured and hesitated, turning a few minutes into a fateful gap. When the disappearance was discovered, the neighbor's spontaneous search disturbed the scene, making it hard for arriving police to determine the last timeline and losing critical data. Later, an item was found, but lacked enough evidence to hold a suspect. Then the case drifted into cold case status, and the family received no further updates. From this, practical advice is in modern life: lock in the moment. As soon as something unusual appears, if you see a stranger approaching a child or behaving unreasonably, don't rationalize it yourself. Intervene safely,
call the child back, maintain distance, get help from another adult, and note basic descriptions. If a child goes missing, prioritize time and data, call 911 early, preserve the last known area, limit access, and accurately record the last scene, down to the minute, clothing, direction, nearby people. Finally, the story also reminds that documents and records are life traces. Stephen grew up with conflicting records that no one cross-checked. So, in a data-driven American society, store copies of important family documents, update emergency contacts, and if there's an unusual gap, don't hesitate to ask, because sometimes the right question at the right time can prevent a tragedy from lasting decades. If you find that the Stephen Allen story shows truth, even when late, can still be found, please subscribe to the channel to continue following with us other cold cases waiting to be illuminated. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where each file is not just a case, but the life of a human being.